Riot is the multi-core scheduler for OCaml 5 that lets you write programs in OCaml that are multi-core for free, where you orchestrate processes, OCaml processes, like tiny virtual like green threads, not OS processes. And you can have hundreds of thousands of those. They're really cheap. And have them communicate with each other via type-safe message passing, bringing all of the things that are good about Erlang and the Erlang ecosystem and the Elixir ecosystem into OCaml. So you know how we talked about how OCaml had started with this ML family of languages that were like, can we make programs that don't crash, right?
Yeah.
The Erlang way of thinking is super different, right? And it was primarily developed under like strict market and product constraints. And they take the approach of saying programs will crash. So, let them and deal with it, right? Like embrace that failure in some way. So it's a very different school of reliability. And they're both excellent, right? And they're actually compatible. You can build software that plays to both, teams of that split. And I think that will be perhaps the best place to get reliability from, because you get reliability from this never crashes, but when it does, because it will, then you also have this approach.
Yeah.
And the way that Erlang does this is by building this idea of supervision trees.
Yep.
Where a program in Erlang is composed of tiny, thousands, if not millions, of tiny little processes, which are not operating system processes. They're tiny units of computation within the Erlang program, right? Super cheap to use, and they communicate via message passing. And they can be monitored. So one process can actually be looking at other process and know, that process crashed, right? So the Erlang motto of let it crash comes from the ability to say, I will have another process, right, looking at you. So when you crash, that process will restart you, right?
Yeah.
And start from a known state.
Yeah.
Which is a fabulous way of building reliable systems, right? Because it is virtually impossible to kill an Erlang system.
Yeah.
And I adore that. I love that. I think it's fantastic. It's like a living organism in some sense. It's like it's struggling to live, and it's just wants to stay alive. So having a background in Erlang, I've been struggling with scaling code bases in Erlang, right? If you keep grabbing code, then you need more and more and more tests. You need to program more and more defensively and just like assert many places. And even then, at some point, you make a change and like you have to wait a long time for all your tests to run to make sure that you haven't broken anything. Collaboration can be tricky as well because you don't have a lot of static guarantees, right? And that kind of means that scaling Erlang is hard. It's expensive as well. Which is one of the reasons I think a lot of the people that work in Erlang work in rather small teams, right? Infamously, the WhatsApp story of like 10 engineers, working in the code base, serving billions of messages a day. Yeah, that sort of thing. So at some point, I started writing this thing called OCaml, which was trying to bring in some of the safety from OCaml into Erlang, right?
Right.
And I went through a phase there trying to type Erlang, trying to understand what is the subset of the language that can be typed, because the language is quite dynamic in some ways. And I ended up realizing or learning that there is a subset of OCaml, which I call the core language there, right? That is actually Erlang, right? And vice versa. So there is a subset of both languages that is the same language. And I was like, holy crap. Like if you can do that, you can translate from one to the other. So we can get all of the type system of one, right? And just run it on the second one.
Yeah.
And that was interesting. But OCaml didn't pan out because building a whole programming language is an entirely different thing, right? It's a big effort. It's not just the compiler. It's the communities, documentation, examples, libraries, the culture really around that. But yeah, so you can tell eventually OCaml shut down. And sometime later, I was like, well, if we cannot take OCaml onto the Erlang VM, could we take the Erlang VM into OCaml? Right?
Nice and simple. How hard can it be?
Just invert the arrow. What could happen, right? Like what could
really
be the worst thing here?
On the whiteboard.
Yeah, exactly. Very easy on the work. Very, you just have like to draw the arrow on the other end and that's it, right? You're good. But it took a little bit to be able to do that. Because for a long time, OCaml was single-threaded, right? Which meant up until 4.14, so 2 years ago, OCaml was running on a single CPU, and that was it. If you wanted to have more CPUs, you had to spin up more programs and orchestrate the programs from the outside.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And a lot of people make that work very well, Jane Street, right? But I don't like working that way. I like to have my third program automatically be multi-core because that's what I got used to with Erlang and Elixir, right? So when OCaml 5 was released, they introduced two things. One, multi-core, which I was like super excited about. But the second feature that was fundamental for being able to build Riot was algebraic effects.
All right.
And we don't have to dig too much into that because that could be a podcast on its own, right?
That would be a link in the show notes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so algebraic effects, asterisk, right? And that means we get resumable continuations in OCaml, which are pretty much Erlang processes, right? And when I saw that, I was like, holy shit, this is it. This is the moment. We need to build it. All of the cores, right, that have failure isolation for very small things or large things. And that means we can write systems in OCaml that run like in Erlang.